So what is a lobotomy? A lobotomy is a procedure given to those suffering with extreme mental health conditions. It is done by using a sharp tool to go in through a person's tear duct and then maneuver into the brain to sever neural connections. Today we will look into how this procedure became a standard medical practice and why it is no longer used today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this. And we're in another room. This isn't the room, don't worry, that is coming. But for now, this is the room that we are using. I really hope the next time I see you, we will be in the new room, the room that is made for YouTube. But I've just been really sick and really busy, so I'm really sorry. Say really again.
Stop it. Get some help.
I think we're just going to settle on the idea that I produce one YouTube video a month. How awful is that? Life's just too busy. I know you understand how I feel. If I did this full time, then I could do 5 videos a week. But until then, 1 video a month might be where we're at. So on to today's video. Is anyone else really fascinated by old medical practices? I feel like they were really brutal and barbaric. And I know that's because we have such a higher level of medical information given to us now. And we understand what works and what doesn't to a higher degree. But it just seems absolutely wild that these old medical practices were ever allowed to be performed. And lobotomies have sincerely fascinated me because actually we didn't stop using them until too long ago. And some places haven't stopped using them at all. Mental health has had a really tough time being understood in history. Even in today's world, mental health has such a huge void of understanding. And unfortunately, because of this was one of the reasons as to why lobotomies became such a common practice to anyone who had episodes of not being normal in society. Quick disclaimer, I am well aware there is no such thing as normal. Everyone has quirks and everyone has interesting parts about them which allows humanity to be a broad, interesting race. But back in time, anyone who didn't act accordingly could be thrown in an asylum and given a lobotomy. Lobotomies were given to people that had schizophrenia, dementia, bipolar, hysteria, and more. Originally, they were given to people that had extreme mental health issues that actually altered their personality. But as time progressed, lobotomies were handed out quite freely to people that didn't comply with normal day-to-day morals and values. Again, normal. For example, and this isn't uncommon in history, but if a woman spoke out of line or got upset about something that she shouldn't have done, which was pretty much anything, let's be fair, she would have been labelled hysterical and doctors would have probably thought that the only thing for her was to be thrown in an asylum and had a multitude of procedures which likely would have included a lobotomy. There were so many horrible treatments in asylums, but we definitely need a whole nother video on that. Knowing that women were recently given lobotomies for hysteria just reminds me of the witch trials, in which a woman could be called a witch because she spoke out of line or did something that men didn't much approve of. I mean, there was even a thing that if a woman wrote with her left hand, she was a witch, and then she would be sent to be unalived. But again, we need a whole nother video on that. And if you should want a video on witch trials or asylums, please leave me a message in the comment box below. I would absolutely adore to know what you would like to see next. 1891 was the first date in history in which a lobotomy was ever recorded. Swiss psychiatrist Gottlieb Burckhardt performed surgery on several people with severe schizophrenia. He first performed this surgery by removing parts of the brain. He then found that after the procedure, these patients were quieter. This was originally meant to be for palliative care, i.e. when someone is in their last stages of life. The earliest version of lobotomies involved drilling holes, like trepanning. They would then inject ethanol into their brain to destroy the nerve connections. And ethanol, for those who don't know, is pure alcohol. Trepanning or trepanning was used when someone had a head injury or was thought to have been possessed. To really reduce this into a couple of sentences, trepanning was when a part of the skull was removed by a drill to allow the brain to breathe, or allow the demons inside the person to leave. No, seriously. This would of course leave the patient with a hole in their skull, and sometimes a person would have this done a couple of times to ensure the probability of this being successful. Trepanning is thought to no longer be used across the world, however it is technically used as a way to enter the brain during surgery, etc. In 1935, the Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz invented the lobotomy and initially called it a leucotomy. I think that actually said leucotomy, so sorry for that. As previously mentioned, Egan would be the person to put ethanol into the brains of his patients. He was inspired by the earlier work of the Swiss psychiatrist Gottlieb Burckhardt. And just on that, if I'm pronouncing that horrifically, which I most likely am, I am truly sorry. Want to know something that may shock you? Well, Moniz, for creating the lobotomy, was given the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949. Someone who literally harmed people in such a way that after the procedure were no longer themselves anymore and couldn't lead normal lives in a lot of cases, received the Nobel Prize for Medicine. The year after Moniz's invention, an American neurologist named Walter Jackson Freeman adopted the procedure and renamed it the lobotomy. He modified the surgery by introducing the use of a surgical tool instead of alcohol, creating the prefrontal lobotomy, which involved an ice pick-like surgical instrument known as a leucotome. In a prefrontal lobotomy, what the surgeons would do would be to enter the skull at either side of the head, and then with a surgical instrument, they would sever the neural connections. They would sever the connections at the front and other parts of the brain. Later, in 1945, Freeman modified the procedure again and created the transorbital lobotomy, which he could perform quickly without leaving any scars. In a transorbital lobotomy, it works in the same way. However, instead of going in through the sides of the head, it would go in through the tear duct. And just so we all know, the frontal lobe is responsible for the memory, emotions, and problem solving. It's said that lobotomies were effective at handling behaviour because it changes the person and they can no longer act like themselves. It was said to be revolutionary, but it actually did more harm than good, and a lot of people did not need it at all. Most that had it suffered severe and irreversible brain damage. The idea behind lobotomies was to give a person a kind of reset. By severing the connections of the frontal lobe and other parts of the brain, this would cause a person's whole personality to effectively change, and what was ailing them previously would no longer. Moniz and Freeman both reported significant improvements in many of their patients, although many showed no improvement, with some experiencing even worse symptoms. By the early 1940s, people touted the procedure as a miracle cure for mental health conditions, and experts adopted it as part of mainstream psychiatry. But what was for sure was that after a lobotomy, every single patient changed. Freeman and Watts in 1942 were so proud of their patient's response to the lobotomy as the patient walked away from the procedure happier. Freeman and Watts in 1942 have been recorded to say that these patients can be treated a great deal like children, with affectionate references to their irresponsible conduct. They harbour no grudges. However, most patients suffered severely after the procedure. The effects of a lobotomy are highly variable, and this is why it started to become highly controversial. The intention was to reduce agitation, anxiety, and excess emotion. However, many people completely lost a sense of who they were and became a shell of their former selves. Many could no longer function. They became apathetic and soulless. A few even died after their lobotomies. Although some walked out of the hospital and were deemed to be better, I cannot help but think it wasn't really them. They were all physically given brain damage, so I don't believe in the reportings at all. I think it was a method of medicine which was more about helping society than it was the individual. I feel like it was just such a quick solution because mental health really does take a lot of time to work out, and a lobotomy, well, it really only takes seconds. I feel like there was a lot of medical professionals who just could not be bothered to help their patients. But then there was also a part that this was known as revolutionary, so there is another part of me that thinks, well, they were told that this really did help, so they opted for it. But I don't think that enough research went into the after effects of what happened to the person took place when they absolutely should have done. Lobotomies were widely used from the late 1930s through the early 1950s. Roughly 60,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States and Europe within those 20 years. But by the 1950s, the dangers and the side effects of lobotomies were becoming more widely known, which faced a lot of scrutiny from doctors and patients, and the public in general. A very well-known case is that of John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary. She was given a lobotomy by Freeman, and when the procedure was completed, she was permanently incapacitated, and from that point on, she effectively lost her life without dying. Even James Watts, who helped Freeman perform the first procedure, turned against lobotomies as a whole. It was also in the 1950s that antidepressant medication became more widely available. And so many people turned to this instead because they could take the medication at home, they didn't have to go into hospital, and they didn't need to have surgery. So are lobotomies legal, and are they still performed? Lobotomies were banned in the Soviet Union, Germany and Japan. They deemed the procedure as inhumane. However, in Europe and the US, even after a patient had developed a brain hemorrhage, they never banned lobotomies. Lobotomies were still used until the 1990s, and lobotomies, although rarely used today, are not illegal practices. Surgeons occasionally use a more refined type of psychosurgery called a kingulotomy in its place. Yet again, probably said that horrifically. The procedure involves targeting and altering specific areas of brain tissue. This surgery is used to treat OCD and chronic pain. Lobotomies are the most infamous psychiatric treatment in history. What was once seen as a miracle cure is now seen as barbaric by 99% of people. So that was the history of lobotomies. What are your views? I've always been interested in the procedure of lobotomies and how it became so widely used, but then within 10 years it reached its peak and its end. I also find it incredibly unsettling that still within the UK and the USA, it is not an illegal practice. A really good show that features lobotomies is a show called Ratched. A show that Netflix has now decided to cancel, but series 1 was absolutely fantastic. I would really love to do a video on asylums and all the medical treatments that they gave within them, just because I think once before when I was looking into the history of insanitariums and asylums, this is when I first discovered what a lobotomy was. I also think it's so strange to hear that until 1990, we were still using lobotomies as a medical practice. That's 30 years ago, that's it. I think lobotomies as well seem extra chaotic and barbaric because a lot of people do not like anything to do with their eyes. And the idea that for the sake of scarring, they would use an instrument and go in through the tear duct. Oh. But if you never heard of lobotomies before, please let me know. If you want a video on asylums and insanitariums, or you'd like a video on the witch trials, please also let me know in the comments box below. Pretty sure I just said comments box. You know what I mean. I also just want to take this opportunity to welcome my newest Patreon, Lawrence. Lawrence, you are also my top tier Patreon, and I couldn't be more appreciative to you. Because of that, Lawrence will be getting a personalised Sarah Sinister mug and exclusive access to all the content that I post behind the scenes. I would also just like to thank my first ever Patreon, Chris. You are amazing, and you don't just support me on YouTube, but you also support me on TikTok, which is where I've been hiding for a few months now. But please expect at least one new video every single month. If I can do more, I absolutely will. YouTube is my favourite hobby, and I really don't want to stop seeing you guys. But for now, that is all from me. Thank you so much for your patience on these videos and for messaging me when I go a little bit quiet. It really does show that you care, and I appreciate you wholeheartedly. But until then, that is all from me. Take care of yourselves and others, and bye bye for now.